The Australian Financial Review.
There was a time when I was at uni when I was really anti-mining. I went to a protest or something like that.
When Samantha Langley left school to study environmental science, she thought mining companies were the enemy.
I remember when I started working and went into government, and that's one of the reasons I thought, I'll be a regulator of all these companies.
It's funny how things work out. 2 decades later, Samantha works for the biggest mining company of them all. And her pet project could, in theory, completely offset the carbon footprint of BHP's giant iron ore and nickel mining divisions in Australia.
Hello, I'm Sam Langley and I'm part of the business development team at BHP Nickel West, and I'm working on one of the world's biggest mineral carbon sinks located right here in Western Australia's goldfields.
Everyone knows we need to do something about climate change, but what's not clear is how do we fix it?
Low emissions technologies.
There is net zero modelling.
Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Change isn't just coming, it's already underway. We're living through a massive industrial revolution where just about everything we do is going to have to change in less than 3 decades. Empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. I'm Peter Kerr from the Carbon Challenge team at the Australian Financial Review, and this is Tech Zero. It's a podcast about the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the inspiring people who are putting their heart and soul into making them work.
I began writing what they call a mission statement.
In the hit film Jerry Maguire, Tom Cruise's character has an epiphany and stays up all night writing his manifesto for the future of the sports marketing industry. Samantha Langley can relate to that. In 2019, her job was to tell government regulators how much greenhouse gas that BHP's Nickel West business was pumping into the atmosphere. Samantha and her colleagues were racking their brains for initiatives that could reduce emissions, when one of them noticed an old academic report on the internet.
The colleague I was with said to me, I was looking on the internet last night and I saw some articles about your Mount Keith tailings facility and it being able to store carbon dioxide in it. And I was like, what? Are you sure? I've never heard of this. So I finished my work day. I went home, I cooked dinner for the kids, put them to bed. I Googled until 1 o'clock in the morning and I was reading article after article about our Mount Keith facility, a site that I'd been at and stood on the dam, could store carbon in it. And I just couldn't believe it. It was just almost unbelievable to me for 2 reasons, is that this is an amazing storage opportunity for carbon dioxide, but also how did I not know? How did I miss this?
The reports that kept Samantha glued to her computer that night had been done in 2005 by scientists from the University of British Columbia. Those scientists visited BHP's nickel mines and they concluded that carbon was being sucked out of the atmosphere by a sludge dam which held the wastes which came out of the Mount Keith mine. Unbeknown to anyone, the dam had been doing this ever since the mine started in 1995. BHP was told about this at the time, but corporate memory of this amazing opportunity just kind of slipped through the cracks over the subsequent decade when Nickel West was fighting for survival.
It was completed just before kind of the nickel industry went down, the GFC hit, and there wasn't a lot of investment. In fact, Nickel West at one point was looking at being sold or closed. So looking at these opportunities were not really on the radar and we weren't going to be able to invest in them. By the time it got to 1 a.m, I just was so overwhelmed and excited. The opportunity just seemed so big. I had no idea how to take it forward. It was just huge and I just knew in my heart I had to do something.
The tailings dam at Mount Keith is 5 kilometres wide. It's a giant circle. You can jump on Google Earth and have a look at it for yourself. It's kind of grey, black, crusted sludge, basically. In the industry, they call it tailings. If it were in the middle of Sydney, it would stretch from the Opera House all the way down to the SCG. Every day, It receives tailings from the processing plants, which take the nickel out of the supposedly worthless host rock. That grey sludge in the dam is mostly magnesium, oxygen and water.
So what we're left with is just the crushed rock with the nickel removed. That's the tailings, which is really just rock and water. But this rock has that really high amounts of magnesium oxide. The magnesium oxide's never seen the light of day until we mined it. So when it was underground, it hadn't had a chance to be reacted, and it didn't have any exposure to CO2. But we put it out on our dam, and it actually reacts chemically with the CO2 in the air. It's in a very reactive state because the minerals have a high surface area because they've been crushed so finely, and they are spread out across the dam. It reacts in normal temperature and air pressure, so those reactions are happening without us having to do anything more.
Let's call this process mineral carbonation. That's what the scientists call it. It's an extremely secure form of carbon storage with almost no chance of leakage. But don't take my word for it. Listen to what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had to say about it. I've got my producer Lap to read out their quote to you.
The fraction of carbon dioxide stored through mineral carbonation that is retained after 1,000 years is virtually certain to be 100%. As a consequence, the need for monitoring the disposal sites will be limited in the case of mineral carbonation.
Very much like trees and forests can suck their CO2 out of the air and store it in the plants through biological sequestration and photosynthesis. We're actually storing the CO2 in a really similar way, but this is through a chemistry process. And it is a really simple equation when you break it down. It's MgO, which is magnesium oxide, plus CO2, carbon dioxide, equals MgCO3, which is magnesium carbonate. And the best thing about it, it's safe and permanent. It's locked in the mineral for geological time, and it's a true form of carbon dioxide removal, and sometimes it's called negative emissions.
About 80,000 people work for BHP as either an employee or a contractor around the world. So getting noticed is not easy. Samantha wanted to get traction for her carbon sink idea at executive levels and knew she had to fight for attention.
A few weeks after that night that I had where I was having the crazy Googling up till 1 a.m. in the morning, I ended up having quite an exciting chance kind of meeting with a key person in BHP. And Mike Henry had been delivering a briefing to the Perth employees at the Perth Convention Centre, and it was not long before he was CEO, but at the time he was the Minerals Australia president. And he'd been talking about lots of different things we were doing at BHP, and one of those things was climate change. And at the end of that session, he offered to meet employees, and he said, come and talk to me at the end of the session. And there was so many people. There was a really long line, and I was just maybe a little bit too late, and I thought there's no way I'm going to get to talk to him. The line was really long. So I gave up, and I thought, well, there goes my chance to mention to Mike Henry.
Disappointed to have missed her chance to talk to the man who would be BHP's next CEO, Sam drifted back to talk to her work colleagues. But she hung around long enough to notice that people were leaving and Mike Henry was alone and heading for the exit. She was not going to miss her opportunity again.
I just thought, it's now or never, Sam. Just go and talk to him. I went up to him and I said, Mike, we've got an amazing opportunity at Nickel West. We can store carbon in our tailings. We can do it safely. It's permanent storage, and we're going to be having a look at this. And he said to me, that sounds great, Sam. Can you email me? I was like, oh, wow. Now Mike Henry's asking me to email him with this opportunity. So I went straight back to the office and I emailed him, and he wrote straight back to me, and he said, this sounds fantastic. And he CC'd in the head of Innovation Sustainable Operations for BHP Group, and asked her to connect with me, which she did straight away. We met, and we ended up building this great relationship, and at that time nickel price still wasn't great. So by partnering and working with the greater BHP group, we were able to kick off our studies. We did our first study and then a second study with that team. Now that mineral carbonation project is part of our decarbonisation plan. So, yeah, it was a really great outcome, and it just shows, I think, it's you need both. You need the upswell from the operational teams and the asset teams supported by that senior leadership, and things really start to happen.
The original study that was done in 2005 found that the Mount Keith Dam was storing about 40,000 tonnes of carbon each year. To put that in context, that's about 11% of the mine's carbon emissions. Amazingly, BHP is not yet able to claim credit for the carbon that it's storing in the dam at Mount Keith, because it's not yet ratified by the Australian government as an official carbon sink. And it won't be until a methodology for measuring mineral carbonation is agreed between the government and industry. Until then, BHP's official carbon footprint at Nickel West will be 40,000 tonnes per year bigger than it really is. But that 40,000 tonnes is small fry. It represents just 1% of the dam's carbon storage potential. A much bigger prize is on offer if Samantha's team can find a way to introduce more carbon dioxide to the dam.
When we're depositing tailings, they kind of sit out there flat, and what can happen is you get a reaction happen for the very top layer of the dam, and then the minerals underneath don't get a chance to carbonate. It almost like forms like a crust over the top of the dam. And other things that happen is, we might cover over the tailings with more tailings before we have the chance for it to react. So we're looking at ways that we can increase that surface area and make sure that even if we had the CO2 in the air, whether it's at 420 ppm or at a much higher concentration, we still need to have that exposure to the minerals. We have things that we could do to the tailings, and that's part of the work that we're doing now, is having a look at the sort of technologies that would give us a increase in the rate.
Is it right that there's some guy walking around the edge of the dam with basically a paddle, just turning this stuff over?
Oh, that probably wouldn't be enough. I think we would need to do a lot more. But in theory, yes, that's what we want to do. It would take someone a long time with a paddle over a 5 kilometre wide dam. So, yeah, this is the sort of thing that we can look at is tilling and turning the tailings, so that once it's kind of crusted over and had that reaction, we can then turn it over and we can expose fresh tailings to the air again. So we would be able to carbonate around 10% of the minerals using that, but the other 90% needs some sort of additional help.
But Samantha's team are already dreaming bigger. They've got studies underway that, if successful, would carbonate 100% of the tailings in the dam.
We can do that through thermal activation, so by heating the minerals up, and by chemical activation, by using reagents to get the minerals to be able to store more carbon. So this is where we start moving into much more engineering type solutions, which generally come at higher cost, of course, and higher energy input as well. But these treatments allow us to achieve much more carbon storage. The total capacity of the dam that it could store is around 4 million tonnes a year. And so when you look at that in comparison to Nickel West's annual emissions, so this is everything from our mining right through to smelting and refining, to be able to offset 4 times your business's emissions is really significant.
Let's stop and do some math on the back of an envelope. On the day we recorded our interview with Samantha, the price for Australian carbon credit units was $35. At those prices, Mount Keith is currently capturing about $1.4 million worth of carbon per year. For a big company like BHP, that's Christmas party money. But that would become $140 million per year if Mount Keith's carbon sink can be ramped up to its full potential. On the day of our interview, European carbon prices were just over 124 Australian dollars per tonne. On that metric, Mount Keith's full potential could be worth $500 million a year in carbon credits. And what about net zero by 2050? Well, if the world's going to keep temperature rises within 1.5 degrees, BHP is on record as saying a carbon price of $280 per tonne could be required by 2050. At those sorts of prices, Mount Keith would be capturing more than 1.5 billion worth of carbon each year. Now, the numbers I've just shared with you are super speculative, but the point is, nickel might not be the only thing of value that comes out of Mount Keith in future.
We're probably never going to get to the full 4 million tonnes, but we want to get close to there, and we want to get as much as we can. So in a perfect world, we'd get to 4 million tonnes, but it does come at increasing, and different costs. All the things I've mentioned come at different costs and levels of abatement. But it's enough to offset Nickel West's entire emissions, plus the emissions from all our iron ore businesses in WA, and have some to spare. So the size of the prize is big.
It almost sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Well, after the break, we'll explore why this form of mineral carbonation has never taken off. The good news is there's no shortage of the right rocks to store carbon in the way that Samantha wants to. According to the IPCC, there's enough suitable geology in the world to store all of the carbon that would be generated if all the world's fossil fuel reserves were burned. People would know BHP is a huge company with lots of mines in different commodities producing different metals. Can this be done at some of your other mines, or is it something unique to your WA nickel mines?
So there are other mine sites and locations where mineral carbonation is an opportunity. Definitely ultramafic rock, which is the magnesium-rich rock, is associated with nickel mining, and certainly one of the best opportunities. Nickel West does have a high amounts of this material that can store carbon, and it's an obvious first place to start for BHP, but there are potentially other BHP sites where this is possible. Many nickel mines around the world, particularly in Australia and Canada, have these magnesium-rich deposits, and diamond mines. Some of those can have ultramafic minerals as well. Copper mines may have an opportunity, and also bauxite residue. So this is sometimes called red mud, and it's part of the alumina processing. And this can be carbonated, this red mud, and it has been done before. In fact, Alcoa at their Kwinana operations have used a high purity CO2 source and carbonated. So this was from a nearby chemical processing plant, and they used that CO2 to carbonate their bauxite residue, and this made the residue safer. So we know that they've successfully done this.
Over in California, they're even looking into whether old asbestos mining waste could be a carbon sink. Now, that would be quite a redemption story if the mineral that was blacklisted over its links to deadly lung disease suddenly emerged as the saviour of our climate.
There's also minerals that are in, for example, old coal-fired power station fly ash. There's a stock of that around, I believe, and in metal and steel making, furnace slags. So this is a really fantastic opportunity for steel making, where you can take the CO2 emissions from steel making and react it with either the minerals in the slag itself or with a ultramafic type of rock similar to what we've got.
So what's holding back this revolution in carbon sinks? Most of the academic research on this topic suggests that high costs have held back widespread adoption. The cost has been put at anywhere between $50 a tonne of carbon stored and $1,600 per tonne of carbon stored. That incredibly wide cost range reflects a multitude of different geologies, different methods that can be deployed to capture the carbon, and also the fact that there's very few projects that exist in the real world. Most of those cost estimates are based on laboratory scale projects. So you should probably take those numbers with a grain of salt. Each project is going to have its own unique cost structure, and Samantha wasn't permitted to share BHP's estimates for Mount Keith with us. One thing that's not going to help Mount Keith is the fact that it's located pretty much in the middle of nowhere, about 900 kilometres northeast of Perth. That means there's not many big carbon emitters nearby, and therefore the cost of moving high purity carbon dioxide to the dam, or vice versa, is probably going to be high. Suffice to say, to be viable, most mineral carbonation projects will need a serious price on carbon or the ability to sell the waste products as something like building materials.
We have an opportunity with our tailings to put it through a processing plant like this and create carbon neutral building products which can be sold. So this is a magnesium carbonate and silica products that can be sold into the building industry for things like cement. And we know these industries are also wanting to decarbonise, and they have their own net zero targets. So there is the potential for our tailings to become a saleable product. Whilst the capital cost of building that sort of facility is high, we have the potential there to also create a revenue from a waste stream. So, we're looking at something that would normally sit out on a dam that I've kind of, in the past, like people have seen as a liability, that we can actually turn into something that's useful and sustainable and can help others to decarbonise their processes as well.
Not so long ago, mining companies saw the employment of environmental scientists like Samantha as a cost of doing business. But Samantha's no longer limited to compliance. Her skills have been called into BHP's business development team. Now that might sound like a subtle change of bureaucratic reporting lines, but it's actually a massive paradigm shift in the way that big mining companies think. To use a sporting metaphor, Samantha's now hired to play offence for BHP, as well as defence.
We want to create zero carbon nickel. That's our end goal. So rather than looking at it as just a compliance thing, it's actually an opportunity. We're going through a phase of planning to grow our business to meet the demand for nickel for electric vehicles and batteries. How do we do it without growing our emissions? How do we reduce our emissions? And how do we build new smelters and refineries and new processing plants that are already net zero? So it's a really different way of thinking, and to plan early in a project means you make really good decisions.
The most powerful people in the global mining industry are now convinced that commodities will fetch higher prices in future if they're made with low or zero carbon footprint. If they're right, the carbon sink at Mount Keith could enable BHP to fetch a green premium, as they're called, for its Australian nickel. Samantha's team is working on all sorts of possibilities to use the Mount Keith carbon sink to create new revenue lines or just make the old revenue lines more valuable.
It is possible that we will, at the end, have excess. So we will want to keep potentially some offsets for ourselves and to offset our remaining hard-to-abate emissions in the short term. But there will be a point where we may be able to sell offsets, and there's lots of options there. We could, within BHP, use them. We may even be able to work within our supply chains to decarbonise our supply chains with our mineral carbonation offsets. So as we sell our nickel, we may be able to sell offsets and things like that. So there's lots of opportunities to look at how we can commercialise this, and not just for ourselves, but to share the offsets with others.
There's 15 years of life remaining at Mount Keith Nickel Mine, based on the official estimate published by BHP last year. Now, in reality, that's a very conservative estimate. You can be pretty sure the mine will last at least double that time. But the point is, it will run out of nickel one day. And when it does, will it shut down? Or will carbon be priced in a way by then that allows the mine to continue mining the once worthless magnesium rock for the purpose of carbon storage?
I think there may be a day when we are mining magnesium oxide just for its carbon potential, and this has been confirmed by some of the world's experts that they can see a day that this could happen. But in the meantime, the resources industry in Australia and globally already have plenty of these minerals above the ground. They're crushed and they're ready to get us started. These days when I fly into Mount Keith, compared to early in 2019 when I didn't know about this, I now fly into Mount Keith and look down from the plane and I can see this huge dam, and I just see a massive opportunity.
How optimistic are you that the world will get to net zero by 2050?
I'm really positive about it. I think that there's enough people with just that passion and drive, and where we can use existing skills that people have the knowledge now. So you say 2050, but in my mind, we can reach this much sooner.
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. Join us next week when we travel to South Australia to see the world's first power station that runs on waste oats. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr, produced and edited by Lap Fan, technical production by Cormac Lally and Rob Fletcher. The artwork was by Yerevan Delanchian, and we want to say a special thanks to the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age video and audio teams, as well as 6PR radio station in Perth. This podcast was executively produced by Fiona Buffini. At the Australian Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. You can subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. Tech Zero is part of the Financial Review's Carbon Challenge franchise. If you want to get in touch with us at Tech Zero, you can email us at techzero@afr.com.
The Australian Financial Review.